April 1946. Harry Truman sat in the Oval Office, and he couldn't sleep. The war in Europe had ended less than a year ago, but the peace felt like a lie. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator who'd been America's ally against Hitler, now had his Red Army sitting in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. Countries that were supposed to be liberated were becoming Soviet satellites. Winston Churchill had just given that speech in Missouri about an iron curtain descending across Europe. And Truman was thinking about ice. Specifically, Greenland. During World War II, the U.S. had occupied Greenland to keep the Nazis from taking it. Why did that matter? Because Greenland had weather stations, and whoever controlled those stations could predict storms over the Atlantic. That meant knowing when it was safe to launch bomber raids over Europe or send supply convoys across the ocean. Weather data was a military weapon. The Germans knew it. So did the Americans. American soldiers manned those stations throughout the war, tracked German U-boats from the coast. Truman had seen the reports. He knew that if the next war came, and he was increasingly sure it would, the Arctic wouldn't just be a battlefield, it would be the battlefield. Why? Because Soviet bombers could fly over the North Pole straight to New York, cutting the distance by thousands of miles. There'd be almost no warning time. American early warning radar systems would need to be positioned as far north as possible to catch them before they reached U.S. airspace. Greenland sat right between the U.S. and the USSR. Geography made it a shield, or it could be a dagger pointed at America's throat, depending on who controlled it. So Truman made a decision. He called in his Secretary of State, James Burns. "I want to buy Greenland," he said. Burns thought he was joking at first, but Truman wasn't smiling. He was serious, dead serious. Burns flew to Copenhagen and sat down with Danish officials. The meeting was quiet, discreet. He laid out the offer, $100 million in gold. In 1946 money, that was roughly $1.5 billion in today's terms. Now, for context, the U.S. had bought Alaska from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million. Truman was offering Denmark 14 times that amount. For a frozen island with 20,000 people and almost no economic output, Burns made the pitch. He talked about security, about partnership, about Denmark being relieved of the financial burden of maintaining a territory that cost more than it produced. He was persuasive, confident. The Danes listened politely. Then they said no. Not "let us think about it," not "make us a better offer," just no. Burns was stunned. He filed a report back to Washington. Truman read it, confused. Denmark was spending money every year just to keep Greenland running. They weren't making a profit. The U.S. was offering them a fortune for what was essentially a block of ice. Why would they say no? The official Danish response was about sovereignty and tradition. Greenland had been under the Danish crown since 1721. It was a matter of national pride. But Truman suspected there was something else. Maybe Denmark saw what he saw. Maybe they knew that whoever controlled Greenland controlled the Arctic. And maybe they weren't ready to hand that over, even for a mountain of gold. The offer died quietly. Greenland stayed Danish. Fast forward 73 years. Another American president tried the exact same thing, and Denmark said no again. But here's what's insane. In 1946, Denmark probably should have taken the money. Back then, Greenland was genuinely worthless, a financial black hole. Today, Greenland might be the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet. So what changed? Let's go back to the beginning. Why was Greenland ignored for so long? Year 985. Eric the Red, a violent, red-haired Norse explorer who'd been exiled from Iceland for murder, sails west and discovers a massive island covered in ice. He names it Greenland as a marketing trick, hoping the name will attract settlers. It works. Sort of. Within a few decades, Norse Vikings established 2 settlements on Greenland's southern coast. They raised sheep, cattle, trade walrus ivory back to Europe. For about 400 years, they survive. And then, they disappear. By the 1400s, every single Norse settlement in Greenland is abandoned. Historians still debate why. Some say the climate got colder, the Little Ice Age made farming impossible. Some say they were wiped out by Inuit populations. Some say they just starved. But the real answer is simpler. The economics didn't work. Think about it. You're a Viking farmer on Greenland in the 1300s. You're trying to grow crops in soil that freezes 8 months a year. You're trying to raise livestock that can barely graze. And for what? To trade a few furs and ivory tusks back to Europe, where the shipping costs eat up any profit? It's a losing game. So people left. Fast forward to 1721. Denmark-Norway officially claims Greenland as a colony. A missionary named Hans Egede sails there with his family, convinced he'll find the lost Norse settlers and convert them to Christianity. He doesn't find any Norse people. They're long gone. But Denmark plants its flag anyway. And here's the thing. Denmark didn't claim Greenland because it was valuable. They claimed it because they didn't want anyone else to have it. This was the age of European empires. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, everyone was grabbing territory. So Denmark thought, if we don't take Greenland, someone else will. But they had no plan to make money from it. Because the economics of the 18th and 19th centuries followed a simple rule. The cost of extraction cannot exceed the value of what you extract. Colonial empires wanted farmland, warm water ports, navigable rivers. Why? Because these things reduce costs. You can grow cash crops like sugar and cotton, you can ship goods easily, you can move armies quickly. Greenland had none of this. No farmland, no warm ports. The interior was buried under an ice sheet 2 kilometers thick. Shipping anything in or out was insanely expensive. And even if you could mine something valuable, the cost of getting it to market would destroy your profit margin. So Greenland sat there, ignored. A colonial afterthought that nobody wanted to talk about at dinner parties. But there was one precedent that hinted at what could happen if the economics ever shifted. Alaska, March 30th, 1867. U.S. Secretary of State William Seward signs a deal with Russia to buy Alaska for $7.2 million. That's about 2 cents per acre. The American public loses its mind. Newspapers call it Seward's Folly and Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. Critics mock it as a wasteland of ice and seals. Why would the U.S. waste money on frozen tundra? Seward has a response. He argues that Alaska has strategic value. It positions the U.S. in the Pacific, blocks Russian expansion, and who knows what resources are up there. But nobody's listening. He's ridiculed for years. Then, 30 years later, gold is discovered in the Klondike. Fortune seekers flood into Alaska. Then oil. Then, during World War II and the Cold War, military bases. Suddenly, Alaska is one of the most strategically important territories the U.S. owns. The lesson? Frontier assets are mocked before they're monetized. People only see value when the conditions for profit exist. In the 1860s, those conditions didn't exist for Alaska. And in the 1800s and early 1900s, they definitely didn't exist for Greenland. But history had just proven something important. If the economics changed, ice could turn into gold. Greenland was just waiting. Let's jump to the mid-20th century. What was Greenland's economic situation? In one word, broke. Denmark was spending millions every year to maintain Greenland, healthcare, infrastructure, education, subsidies. Greenland's population hovered around 20,000 to 30,000 people in the mid-1900s. There was no way such a small population could generate enough tax revenue to cover the costs of running a modern territory. So why did Denmark keep it? Politics, prestige, and honestly, because abandoning it would have looked worse than keeping it. After World War II, decolonization was sweeping the globe. India, Indonesia, African nations, colonies were demanding independence. Denmark didn't want to look like it was clinging to empire, but they also didn't want to just hand Greenland to someone else. So they rebranded it. In 1953, Denmark changed Greenland's status from colony to integral part of Denmark. Greenlanders became Danish citizens. It was a political move to avoid the embarrassment of decolonization while still maintaining control. But economically, Greenland was still a drain. The only real income came from one source, the United States. In 1951, during the height of Cold War paranoia, the U.S. military built Thule Air Base in northern Greenland. The base was part of America's early warning system against Soviet nuclear missiles. Radar installations, fighter jets, thousands of personnel stationed in one of the most remote places on Earth, the U.S. Paid Denmark rent for the base. That was it. That was Greenland's only significant revenue stream, American military rent. Now, here's the critical insight, and this is something most people miss. Greenland survived politically because it failed economically. If Greenland had been profitable, empires would have fought over it, wars would have been waged, blood would have been spilled. But because it was a money pit, nobody wanted the burden. Denmark kept it by default, and everyone else ignored it. This is the paradox of worthless territory. Sometimes, being economically irrelevant is the best defense you can have. But that defense was about to crumble. Everything changes starting in the mid-2000s. 3 seismic shifts happen almost simultaneously, and together they turn Greenland from an expensive liability into the most valuable piece of real estate on Earth. Change number 1, the ice started melting. Summer 2007. Scientists at the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado are staring at satellite images, and they can't believe what they're seeing. Arctic sea ice has hit the lowest level ever recorded. Greenland's ice sheet is losing about 280 billion tons of ice per year. Glaciers that have been stable for millennia are calving off icebergs the size of cities. Mark Sorez, the director of the center, later describes it as watching the Arctic fall off a cliff. Now, climate change is obviously a massive environmental and humanitarian issue, but set that aside for a second and look at it purely through an economic lens. Ice isn't just covering resources. Ice is the cost. Let me explain. If you want to mine something in Greenland in 1950, here's what you're dealing with. Permafrost that requires specialized drilling equipment. Ice sheets kilometers thick that make geological surveys nearly impossible. Transport infrastructure that doesn't exist because everything is frozen. Workers who can only operate a few months a year because of extreme cold. Every single one of these factors adds cost. Massive cost. But when the ice melts, those costs collapse. Suddenly, rock that was buried under ice is exposed. Mining becomes feasible. Ports that were frozen year-round are now navigable for longer periods. Transport routes open up. This is the key economic principle. Value doesn't rise just because resources appear. Value rises because the cost of accessing those resources drops. And in Greenland, costs were dropping fast. Change number 2. What was underneath? As the ice melts, geologists start doing surveys they couldn't do before, and they discover something extraordinary. Greenland is sitting on one of the largest deposits of rare earth minerals in the world. Now, if you don't know what rare earth elements are, here's the crash course. They're a group of 17 metallic elements with names like neodymium, dysprosium, praseodymium, terbium. Despite the name, they're not actually rare. They exist in decent quantities all over the Earth's crust. The problem is extraction and processing. Rare earths are mixed into ore with other elements, and separating them out is chemically complex, expensive, and environmentally nasty. You need massive industrial infrastructure to do it at scale. And here's why they matter. Rare earths are in everything modern. Electric vehicle motors, neodymium magnets. Wind turbines, same thing. Smartphone screens, europium and terbium. Fighter jet sensors, rare earths. Missile guidance systems, rare earths. If you want to build 21st century technology, you need these elements. And here's the geopolitical nightmare. China controls about 70% of global rare earth production. This didn't happen by accident. In the 1980s and 90s, Deng Xiaoping, China's leader at the time, made a strategic bet. He saw that rare earths would become critical for future technology, so China invested heavily in the mining and processing infrastructure. They undercut global prices, drove competitors out of business, and cornered the market. Deng allegedly said, "The Middle East has oil. China has rare earths." He was right. By the 2000s, the U.S., Europe, and Japan were almost entirely dependent on China for rare earth supplies, and this created a massive vulnerability. In 2010, China and Japan got into a territorial dispute over some islands in the East China Sea. In retaliation, China temporarily cut off rare earth exports to Japan. Japanese tech companies panicked. The message was clear. If you depend on China for rare earths, they have leverage over you. The U.S. military started freaking out. Pentagon officials realized that if tensions with China escalated, they might not be able to build their own weapon systems. F-35 fighter jets need rare earths. Precision missiles need rare earths. Cutting-edge radar systems need rare earths. You can't fight a modern war without them, which is awkward when your main geopolitical rival controls the supply. So the U.S. started desperately searching for alternative sources, and that's when Greenland became critical. In 2007, a small Australian mining company called Greenland Minerals discovered a massive rare earth deposit at a site called Kvanefjeld in southern Greenland. Estimates suggested it could hold some of the largest reserves outside of China. Suddenly, everyone was paying attention. But here's the thing. This isn't just about mining. It's about supply chain rebalancing. Think of it like this. Imagine one company controls all the wheat in the world. If you want to make bread, you're screwed. You pay whatever they charge. But if a second wheat supplier appears, even if they're not producing yet, the negotiation changes. You have options now. You have leverage. That's Greenland. It's optionality value. The West doesn't even need to mine Greenland's rare earths immediately. Just having access to them reduces dependence on China. And in economics, reducing dependence is reducing risk. And reducing risk is valuable. Change number 3, the shipping route revolution. But the rare earths are only part of the story. Because something else is happening in the Arctic, and it's just as significant. New shipping routes are opening. For all of human history, if you wanted to ship goods from Shanghai to Rotterdam, you had 2 options. Sail south through the Suez Canal, or go all the way around the southern tip of Africa. Both routes add thousands of miles. But there's a third route, the Northwest Passage, that cuts through the Arctic, north of Canada, past Greenland, and into the Atlantic. It's a shortcut that could save 40% of the distance. The problem? For centuries, it's been frozen solid, impassable, until recently. In 2007, the same year Arctic sea ice hit that record low, the Northwest Passage opened for commercial shipping for the first time in recorded history. It wasn't fully navigable yet, but the fact that ships could get through it all was a signal. Climate models predict that by the 2030s or 2040s, the Arctic could be ice-free in the summer months. That means shipping routes that were science fiction a generation ago will become routine. Now, let me give you historical context for why this matters. November 17, 1869, the Suez Canal opens in Egypt. It connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, cutting the distance between Europe and Asia by about 7,000 kilometers. Ships no longer have to sail around Africa. This one canal reshapes global trade. Britain becomes obsessed with controlling it because it's the lifeline to India. Wars are fought over it. Empires rise and fall based on access to it. August 15th, 1914. The Panama Canal opens. It cuts through Central America, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Ships no longer have to go around South America. Again, global trade shifts. The U.S. cements its dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Naval strategy is rewritten. Canals aren't just infrastructure. They're price shock mechanisms. They fundamentally change the cost of moving goods. And when costs change, power shifts. The Arctic routes are the next Suez Canal. And Greenland sits right in the middle of them. If you control Greenland, you control access to these routes. You decide who can ship goods through the Arctic. You have leverage over global trade. Here's the reframe. Greenland isn't territory. It's infrastructure now. So now we've got rare earth minerals worth trillions, new shipping routes that redefine global trade, and extraction costs that have collapsed. Greenland is no longer a liability. It's a gold mine. But here's where it gets messy. Greenland wants independence. For decades, Greenland's population has been pushing for full sovereignty from Denmark, and you can understand why. They have their own language, Greenlandic, an Inuit language completely unrelated to Danish. They have their own culture, their own identity. Why should Copenhagen make decisions for them? In 2009, Denmark granted Greenland self-government. It's not full independence, but it's close. Greenland now controls most of its domestic affairs, education, health, resource management. Denmark still handles foreign policy and defense, and still sends about $600 million in annual subsidies. But Greenland's leaders want more. Mute Bourup-Egede, Greenland's current premier, has made independence a key goal. He said publicly that Greenland should be a sovereign nation. But here's the brutal economic reality. Independence requires money. Greenland has a population of about 56,000 people. To run a country, you need tax revenue to fund healthcare, defense, infrastructure, education. You need access to credit markets so you can borrow money when budgets are tight. You need a functioning economy that can sustain itself. Right now, Denmark's $600 million in annual subsidies represents about a third of Greenland's GDP. That works out to roughly $10,000 per person per year. If Greenland goes independent tomorrow and Denmark cuts the subsidies, the economy collapses. Could rare earth mining replace that revenue? Eventually, maybe. But mining projects take decades to develop. You need billions of dollars in upfront investment. You need processing facilities, ports, roads, power plants. You need environmental approvals, which in Greenland have been a huge political battle. And that's the problem right there. Greenland doesn't have the capital or technical expertise to do this alone. So if Greenland goes independent, they need a partner, someone to finance the mines, someone to build the infrastructure, someone to provide security. And that's where the great powers come in. This is the brutal logic of sovereignty. A nation can vote for independence, but it cannot vote away balance sheets. Russia seized this opportunity. In the last decade, Moscow has built over 40 military bases across the Arctic. They've deployed new icebreakers, upgraded their northern fleet, and expanded air patrols. Vladimir Putin has made Arctic dominance a strategic priority. In 2019, Putin gave a speech where he said, "The Arctic is a region of Russia's special responsibility." Translation, we're claiming this as our sphere of influence. China sees it too. In 2018, Beijing released an official policy paper declaring itself a near-Arctic state, which is absurd, by the way. China is nowhere near the Arctic, but they're angling for influence. Chinese state-owned companies have tried to invest in Greenland's mining projects. In 2016, a Chinese company offered to buy an old naval base in Greenland. Denmark blocked it. In 2018, China offered to help finance 3 new airports in Greenland. The U.S. pressured Denmark to reject the offer, and Denmark ended up funding the airports themselves. This is economic statecraft. China doesn't need to invade Greenland. They just need to finance it. Build the mines, own the processing facilities, control the supply chain. Debt can be just as powerful as tanks. And the United States? They're terrified. In 2019, after Trump floated buying Greenland and got laughed at, the US started quietly increasing its presence there. The State Department reopened a consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, the first time they'd had a permanent diplomatic presence there since 1953. In 2020, the US offered Greenland $12 million in aid for economic development. It's a tiny amount, but it's symbolic. It's a signal. We're paying attention now. Here's what's really happening. Empires are circling. And this isn't new. This is a pattern that's repeated throughout history. When a territory becomes economically critical, powers compete for it. Everyone wants a piece of evil. Not because they're evil, not because of ideology, but because controlling resources and trade routes determines who has power in the next era. In the 1800s, Britain fought wars to control the Suez Canal because it secured the route to India. In the 1900s, the US intervened across Latin America to protect the Panama Canal and access to resources. In the 2000s, wars in the Middle East were fought over oil, and in the 2020s and beyond, the competition is moving to the Arctic. Empires follow spreadsheets, not speeches. So here's the answer to the question we started with. Greenland didn't change. Economics did. For 500 years, the cost of extracting value from Greenland exceeded any potential benefit. The ice was too thick, the infrastructure was non-existent, and nobody needed what was underneath. So it was ignored. But climate change melted the ice. Rare earth minerals became critical for modern technology. Arctic shipping routes opened. The costs collapsed, and the value skyrocketed. And now, Greenland is at the center of a new great power game between the U.S., China, and Russia. This isn't about good guys and bad guys. It's about who positions themselves to control the resources and routes that will define the 21st century. Truman saw it in 1946. Trump saw it in 2019. The strategic calculation hasn't changed. What changed is that Greenland is no longer worthless. And this is bigger than Greenland. This is a preview of what climate change does to geopolitics. As temperatures rise, new territories become economically viable. Resources that were inaccessible become reachable. The map of power gets redrawn. The countries that position themselves now, through diplomacy, investment, or force, will control the next century. So here's my question for you. If you were leading Greenland right now, and three superpowers were knocking on your door offering money, infrastructure, and protection in exchange for access to your resources, which one do you trust? And why? I'm Malcolm, and this is History Meets Economics. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain. Here's another moment. History met economics.